Hello, everyone. My name is Sonia Lee. I'm a professor of art history and East Asian languages and culture at University of Southern California. And a very warm welcome to all of you to our special event today. This is part of the East Asian Studies Center's series on race solidarity, Trans-Pacific Conversations. We launched this series this past year to provide platform for our faculty and students to engage with a host of social and cultural issues related to race and racism on both sides of the Pacific. The topic is all the more relevant today, considering there has been an upsurge in anti-Asian hate and violence this past year, and also the Atlanta mass shooting. So there are many ways to approach this very important topic. And we're very fortunate to have so many faculty here at USC who do innovative research on these topics from very diverse contexts and using different methodologies. And they will provide a guide to us to make sense of all these recent events. As a researcher who work on the pre-modern period, I'm especially pleased that we have two eminent pre-modern historians today who will offer their thoughts and also thought-provoking ideas about race and racism in pre-modern and also modern China, and also in our work here. So, I very much look forward to Professor Yang's discussion and also the question and answer period afterward, to be moderated by my colleague Bettine Burge. Before we begin, I would like to thank the staff at the East Asian Studies Center for making this event as smooth as possible. And so what will happen today is that I will introduce my colleague, Professor Burge, who will then introduce our speaker, and then he will begin the discussion. So for about an hour, he will present for that time period. And then Professor Burge will moderate the question and answer period. So we aim to end about 5:30. Okay, so without further ado, it is really my great pleasure to introduce my colleague Bettine Burge. She's a professor of East Asian languages and cultures with a courtesy appointment in history at our university. She researches the social and cultural history of China and Inner Asia with interest in gender, ethnicity, governance, and law. She is the author of Women, Property, and Confucian Relation in Song and Yuan China, published in 2002. And then Marriage and the Law in the Age of Kublai Khan, it's published in 2017. She won the Franklin Jameson Prize from the American Historical Association for that book. Currently, she's working on another book titled Governing Polyethnic China, The Dilemmas of Identity, Gender, and Social Order in China Under Mongol Rules. So, so please join me in welcoming Professor Burge.
Thank you very much, Sonia. I appreciate that. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce our speaker today, Professor Shaoyun Yang. Professor Yang is Associate Professor of East Asian History and Director of the East Asian Studies Program at Denison University. And his research interests include intellectual and cultural history of Imperial China, especially relating to ethnocultural identity and interactions with and perceptions of ethnocultural others. So exactly the topic of our series here. He's written a wonderful book I can attest to, called The Way of the Barbarians, Redrawing Ethnic Boundaries in Tang and Song China. And I'll see if I can get it to show on the screen here. I'm not sure, I guess, I'm afraid it doesn't work on my background very well with my Zoom background. And 2019, again, it's been a very influential book. Sorry, I can't seem to show it there. Does that show? Not so well, okay. A very influential book that has spurred a great deal of discussion. He's also done some other very interesting works that I find most interesting. He's just publishing a new translation of the Travels of Qiu Chuji. It's called titled A New Translation of the Account of the Perfected Changchun's Journey to the West. You know, this is a very, very famous account of the monk Changchun. This is in collaboration with Ruth Donnell and Stephen West, and it's a new translation after the very old Arthur Waley translation. And this indeed deserved a new update, and I understand it has terrific annotation and many things that we've all been waiting for. So that, I guess, will be coming out very soon. Also, most interesting, he is under contract and working on a book called Race and Ethnicity in Imperial China, a source book. So this will be absolutely terrific for all of us in our teaching and in other things. Also, he's done some very, very interesting digital humanities projects. And I just want to mention a few. He has an incredible digital map project called Frontiers of the Tang and Song Empires. This has 14 interactive, zoomable digital maps with detailed commentary produced with ArcGIS, story maps. And so you can see that. I'm sure he has the link to that on his website. Also, he's done, these are both 2020, a Chinese Gazetteer of Foreign Lands, a new translation of part 1 of the Zhufan Zhi. And this is a new annotated partial translation of an important 13th century ethnographic text accompanied by maps and images, and again, produced with ArcGIS. So very interesting, really helping us get more into accessibility, these maps and commentary, wonderful service to the field. And finally, he has Journeys to the West, Khitan and Jurchen Travels in 13th century Central Asia. And this is a new annotated, these are annotated translations of 2 13th century travelogues, again, accompanied by maps and images. So very exciting. And I just want to repeat as what Professor Lee said, that if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A box. And after the talk, we will take these questions from the audience through the box. So please join me in welcoming Professor Yang to the talk. I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
So let me start by thanking Professor Birch for introducing me and also inviting me to speak to you. And thank you all for coming to listen. I'm sorry I can't see your faces, only your names, but unlike if we were in a sort of actual in-person setting. But I look forward very much to seeing your questions and engaging with them. So let me share my screen now. And let me start with a question, right? Which I guess I'm going to proceed to answer, but maybe not in a way that satisfies many people, at least not at this point. The question is, was there racism in China before modern times? And this is a question that, of course, has a great deal of significance and relevance to contemporary issues surrounding not just China, but also other parts of the world. And my sort of answer is that it partly depends on how one defines race. So this is kind of how I'm going to start the first part of my talk, right? By trying to define or explore different definitions of race that we might encounter and might choose from, and also to talk about the relationship between concepts of race and this other concept called ethnicity that I personally work a lot with, use a lot in my research, and that has been very popular in my field and in other fields in recent decades. So when most people talk about race, they're really talking about race is understood in terms of a 19th century European concept of conceptual framework of human difference, right? So a framework that emerged in Europe essentially in the 19th century, right? And then spread to China, actually through Japan often, right? In the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So you have here race, and then you have nation, you have culture, right? Human beings, according to this framework, were divided into these groupings. And how they kind of like fit together was that human beings were divided into races, and the races were further subdivided into nations. Although, there was often also talk about sub-races within each race. But races were divided into nations, and each nation had its own culture. And the idea was that superior races would produce superior cultures. and that a cluster or grouping of superior cultures that were related to each other might together constitute a civilization. Right? Now, I have here the Chinese translations of these concepts: race, nation, culture, and also civilization. And you might notice that I also have Japanese translations. The Japanese translations actually are older than the Chinese ones. So in this case, you see how the Japanese were in the late 19th century the first to attempt to translate these European Western concepts, which were not native to East Asia at all, into their own language. And then through Japanese influence, the Chinese also began to absorb and accept them. Right. So these are concepts that do not map neatly onto indigenous East Asian concepts. Are nonetheless, because of their of their influence, together with all kinds of Western ideas in the early 20th century, they have become very influential in Chinese discourse about human difference. And to some extent, when the Chinese talk about human difference in their history, even today, they are still often relying on these concepts that came from 19th century Europe. Now, this is kind of like the background, right? This nation, race, nation, culture taxonomy is the background to this, I will call it sinological paradigm, right? A paradigm that exists in the study of traditional Chinese culture and Chinese history, called culturalism, that has been around since about 1940s, and certainly by the 1950s. It's becoming very influential, both in the Western world, in Western, among Western sinologists, but also among Chinese scholars of history. So, culturalism kind of has two forms or two aspects, right? The first here, the first bullet point here is one of them. This idea that pre-modern Chinese identity was based on a kind of Confucian cultural universalism, and because of that lacked a coherent national consciousness. So this is a narrative of culturalism that posits this kind of culturalism or cultural universalism as maybe a kind of a weakness in China when it needed to modernize. It needed to develop a kind of nationalism, but it sort of was slow to do so, right? Because culturalism was how it had thought about this whole idea of being Chinese or being civilized for its entire history up to that point. And then you have in the second bullet point, this other way of talking about culturalism, which is that pre-modern Chinese identity was based on culture, and therefore it was not based on ideas of race or blood or biological descent, right? And here, culturalism is posited not as a weakness or a kind of deficiency, but actually as a strength. This is basically it's used to explain why the Chinese were not racists in pre-modern times, right? The idea was that Chinese identity had immense inclusiveness and assimilative power because anyone could become Chinese by adopting Chinese culture. So this kind of lies at the heart of what is often called the Sinicization narrative or Sinicization paradigm. This idea that Chinese civilization was capable of Sinicizing any culture or ethnic group that it came into contact with, right? Essentially assimilating them into the Chinese civilization and kind of making them one of, the Chinese people. So I have on this slide here a book cover, right? This is Frank Dikötter's Discourse of Race in Modern China. The first edition came out in 1992. A second edition came out about 6 years ago. And Dikötter argued that in pre-modern times, the Chinese did not necessarily draw very clear distinctions between race and culture, unlike 19th century Europeans. But he also kind of ultimately came down on the side of the culturalism paradigm, which is that he argued that most pre-modern Chinese thinkers were cultural universalists, or you could say culturalists. But he did argue that strands of proto-racialist thought existed in pre-modern China, and they eventually merged with imported scientific racism, right? The kind of thinking that we saw on the slide before this one, that was introduced from the West in the early 20th century. right? So Dakota did not deny that there were some kinds of thinking in pre-modern China that could be categorized or described as, proto-racialist, right? Not necessarily racist by in the same way as 19th century European thinking, but kind of like showing some signs or having some commonalities or some similarities. So since the 1990s, a lot of scholars in my field, the field of Chinese history, have moved from this race, nation, culture trichotomy or taxonomy to thinking in terms of ethnicity. This is a kind of newer concept from 20th century social sciences, anthropology, and sociology, in which an ethnic group is defined according to a few kind of characteristics that I've listed here. Right, it has an ethnonym. It has a myth of common ancestry. That doesn't mean that biologically it actually has common ancestry, but it does have a myth or a narrative of such. It has a sense of common culture and history, a link of historical homeland, and a sense of solidarity against other ethnic groups, which may develop into ethnic nationalism through processes of politicization by the state and mass mobilization, right, across class differences, regional differences, and so on. Right. So I should note that there are other narrower and less widely used definitions that some of my colleagues use for ethnicity, which make politicization a kind of prerequisite for ethnicity. So kind of like the ethnic nationalism that I just spoke of, right? Based on that narrow definition, only ethnic nationalism would be kind of considered to be ethnicity, right? Or another way of defining it more narrowly is in terms of political marginalization. So only politically marginalized groups are ethnic, whereas politically dominant groups are not ethnic groups. They are only, let's say, cultural groups or cultural. It's a cultural identity, not ethnic identity. Now, I don't use these narrow definitions, but I do acknowledge that they exist, and that is part of the kind of complexity of the kind of work that's being done on ethnicity in Chinese history in recent decades, which is that we scholars, we historians have yet to really kind of come to a consensus on how to define ethnicity, right? But nonetheless, right, despite this kind of occasional difference of opinion on just what is ethnic and what is not, how do you define what an ethnic group is, the fact remains that ethnic identity, this concept of ethnicity, has become very influential in the study of Chinese history since the 1990s, right? So here are just two covers of books published in the first 10 years of the 21st century. So the Manchu Way was 2001, Ethnic Identity in Taiwan, China was in 2008, right? And these, among several other books that use the ethnic identity framework to study Chinese history, have had a huge amount of influence, and my work really has been informed a great deal by them. But while this was happening, right, in recent decades, in fields other than mine, right, not Chinese history, but let's say medieval studies or classical studies, the study of ancient Greece and Rome, the concept of race has actually become popular again, right? There was a time. For a time, ethnicity was seen as a better concept to use than race, because race was seen as kind of like problematically linked to racism and scientific racist thought. So to speak of race as an analytical kind of category or concept seemed to sort of like be implicated in racist thinking itself. But as I said, in recent decades, there have been scholars, not in Chinese history, not yet, right? But in the study of medieval Europe and the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean world, who have begun talking about race as a concept that actually is applicable and relevant to pre-modern periods, and it should not be seen only as a concept that emerges in early modern Europe and is then relevant from that point onwards. So here's the cover of Geraldine Heng's very influential Dimension of Race in the European Middle Ages, came out a few years ago, and then we have the poster for one of the Race Before Race events. Now, Race Before Race is a network of scholars, predominantly scholars of color, studying pre-modern periods, mostly in the Western world, but also the Islamic world, and increasingly also Asia. That basically are what they have in common is that they believe that this concept of race is applicable and actually significant in the study of the pre-modern world. So how do these scholars who use race in the more recent work actually think about race? What kind of definition of race are they using? It is not the same as the scientific racist 19th century understanding of race. It is actually very heavily informed by critical race theory, or CRT. So, CRT has been in the news a lot this year. It's basically aroused a great deal of controversy and debate. So I'm not going to have to, describe it a great deal to you, I believe. But you can see some basic facts or basic information about CRT, where it originated from. What I'll emphasize here is that CRT views race as a social construct, right? Not a biological reality. It does not believe that human beings actually are biologically divided into races, right? Basically the study of human genetics has disproven this idea that things like skin color can be used to determine what a person's kind of biological race should be. There's actually a huge amount of genetic variety, of genetic diversity, even among people with the same shade of skin. So CRT views race as a social construct, but it does at the same time argue that it is a social construct that has had and continues to have real societal consequences, because it's a construct, a concept that has informed and influenced, shaped systems and institutions that developed over time, right? Basically were created by people who believed that race was a real thing. It basically, in the U.S. context, it argues that American institutions are perpetuating a certain white supremacy or white privilege through a mode of, it's called various names, but it's structural, systemic, institutionalized, or societal racism, right? And that this is actually preventing the U.S. society from being fully, truly meritocratic and egalitarian. So how does critical race theory, how does CRT sort of influence this newer kind of use of race to analyze the pre-modern world? So here I kind of turn to my colleague at Denison, who studies ancient Athens, Rebecca Futo-Kennedy. She has really helped me a lot with this. A few years ago, I was still kind of like not really sure what to make of this, right? I had been using ethnicity in my research, and I found, ethnicity kind of is a good enough concept, and I don't really understand why race, needs to be used alongside ethnicity, right? What's the difference between the two? Here's a blog post by Rebecca from last December, right, where she really kind of very clearly lays out what she and other scholars that have been influenced by CRT believe is the difference between race and ethnicity, right? So as she says here, race, as I use it here, is a technology, a doctrine of population management that institutionalizes ethnic prejudice, oppression, and inequality based on imaginary and moving signifiers for human difference, signifiers that manifest differently in different times and places. They are transhistorical and fluid. But this understanding of race is different from what we might consider folk ideas of race in the modern context, what has been called somatic or epidermal race or biorace. So somatic, which basically means skin, skin-based, right? Or epidermal also. So basically the idea of race as a kind of biological thing that can be discerned from physical features like skin color, right? Rebecca Kennedy and other CRT influenced scholars kind of would call that a kind of folk idea of race, a modern idea of race, but not necessarily the only idea or understanding of race that is useful to the study of prejudice or othering in human history, right? And she says, when I use the term ethnicity or ethnic in discussion, I am referring primarily to self or other defined groups based on ideas of shared culture, language, or political affiliation that are not embedded within legally enforceable hierarchies of oppression. that's quite a mouthful, right? So let me kind of explain what, or let her explain what the difference is, right? So in order for race to exist, as most scholars of critical race or CRT suggest, it must exist within a political order, not simply as an abstracted category. Without the creation of hierarchies and the ability to enforce oppressions, we have prejudice or ethnocentrism, right? But not race. It is the power of a state or institutions to enforce social political otherness that determines race. So I'm not sure, if you're kind of like recognizing the point that she's trying to make here. But if I could kind of sum it up in just a very short sentence, right? Ethnicity, as understood according to this framework of definitions, is ethnic identity. It's identity, right? Whereas race is state-enforced ethnic inequality, right? So ethnicity is about the identity, but it doesn't involve or doesn't presuppose any kind of ethnic oppression, inequality, or supremacy. Whereas race speaks to a situation, a structural kind of relationship in which ethnic inequality does exist and is in fact enforced or institutionalized by the state. So having kind of gone through these concepts and issues, I think I can move on to the second part of my presentation. And the kind of relevance of the race aspect may not be immediately evident, but I promise we will sort of eventually get to that. And I'll show you how understanding race and ethnicity in Imperial Chinese history could benefit from my attempt at reconceptualizing Imperial Chinese ethnic discourse in a way that doesn't rely on these old 19th century conceptual categories: race, nation, and culture. So 20th century interpretations of Imperial Chinese identity can be understood according to this diagram that I've sort of like drawn for you here. The kind of idea is that there are exclusive understandings of empire and inclusive understandings of empire, and also exclusive understandings of Chinese identity and inclusive understandings of the same, right? So the inclusive idea of empire is often labeled as cosmopolitan, right? The exclusive idea of empire is often called xenophobic or exclusionist. And then you have the culturalist, the familiar culturalist paradigm, which also is often called cultural universalism or Confucian universalism, under the inclusive identity box, right? And in the exclusive identity box, you have often something that is described as racism or racialism, but has also by some scholars or historians been called proto-nationalism, right? So maybe not equivalent to modern nationalism, but a proto kind of version of that, right? And some scholars will also say that the racism or racialism in this box should also be called proto-racism or proto-racialism because it's not identical to modern racism. So this is basically the kind of toolbox of interpretations of concepts that I was trained to work with. So to speak, right? This is a toolbox that people in my field have been using for quite some time now, right? And they basically, when they look at a primary source from Imperial China that talks about human difference, they are often just trying to kind of fit into one of these boxes. So the new conceptual categories that I have come up with in my recent work kind of look like this. There are ethnic understandings of empire and civilization, and there are also supra-ethnic understandings, which means that these are understandings of empire and civilization that transcend ethnic difference or ethnic identity. So you have on the supra-ethnic side, Imperial Universalism and Confucian Universalism, which could be something like culturalism, but in the next slide I'll explain what I mean by this term. And then on the ethnic side, you have Chinese supremacism and what I call civilization state discourse. Now, here are my definitions, right? Imperial Universalism ascribes to the emperor a mandate to rule over all peoples and lands with no natural limits to the extension of his patrimonial authority via territorial conquest. So some of you who work in the field of, like, say, Ming history, right, might see kind of find this familiar because it's kind of how the Ming historian Timothy Brook has kind of defined or explained this concept that he calls the Great State, right? So he's argued that the Mongol Empire, right, when China was incorporated in the Mongol Empire, Chinese understandings of empire kind of fundamentally changed and became much more universal and expansive. Where I kind of differ with from Tim Brooke here is that I believe that this kind of Great State understanding of empire can be traced back to the earliest empires in Chinese history, right? It wasn't like the Mongols who just brought it in for the first time. Although the Mongols, of course, kind of like made good use of it, right? And kind of merged it with their own understandings of empire. And then Confucian Universalism is a way of thinking that kind of views Confucian norms for morality and civilization, right? Often called the way of the sages being these kind of perfectly moral human beings that kind of were believed to have ruled the Chinese civilization in very ancient times. And Confucius was seen as kind of like the last of the sages, right? Even though he didn't actually rule anything, right? But he sort of transmitted the way of the sages to later generations through the classics that he's believed to have compiled. So that this way of the sages is seen as transcending ethnic and geographical differences and attainable by all human beings, not just one ethnic group or another. Now, let me kind of give you my definitions for the ethnic side of the diagram, right? So Chinese supremacism is basically what I call a view of the world order, right? That basically holds that a Chinese-dominated sort of Cinecentric world order is morally normative, normal, and beneficial to everyone, right? Both Chinese and the so-called barbarians, basically those peoples who are not Chinese. And conversely, that a barbarian-dominated world is morally aberrant and catastrophic to all of humanity, right? And I'll have more to say about this in a little bit, right? But the last one I have here is civilization-state discourse, right? Which is basically a way of thinking about the Chinese empire, right, or the Chinese civilization, which identifies certain kind of normative physical boundaries. Could be mountains, could be deserts, it could be the sea, for the imperial state, right? So these boundaries are normative and are meant to be permanent, right? Basically, this discourse interprets these boundaries as coterminous with a permanent heaven-ordained boundary, heaven being this cosmic force that kind of regulates the universe to ensure that moral, the moral right will prevail, right? So this kind of permanent heaven-ordained boundary between civilized, morally superior Chinese and morally inferior barbarians, other peoples that are not Chinese. So here is where I would like to kind of lay out my current positions on what I've just kind of laid out here, like how these concepts actually emerged and unfolded and evolved across the span, the very long span of Imperial Chinese history. Right? I've kind of tried to summarize them, condense them into 10 points. And hopefully, these points will kind of make clear what my position is, how I think ethnicity and race should be sort of understood as, informing how the Chinese thought about themselves and about the rest of the world at different points in their history. So my first, point, very important aspect of my basic position is that I believe there was a coherent classical Chinese ethnic identity, which I call, Hua or Xia, right? And this is actually distinct from both the pre-modern and the modern Han ethnic identities that we see in China today, right? The modern one that we see in China today, and also its pre-modern sort of like precursor or pre-modern version. Now, this is actually more controversial and sort of like open to debate than you might think. Right? You might look at this and say, well, this is common sense, right? There must have been some kind of Chinese ethnic identity. But, because scholars in my field kind of define ethnicity differently, I do have colleagues whose work I, greatly respect, who have argued that there was no Chinese ethnic identity before modern times, right? Or before a certain point in Chinese history. It's usually kind of like in the medieval period, at least. Because that identity was not politicized or something of that kind, right? But my position is that if we use the kind of broad Smithian definition of ethnic identity, then there quite evidently was a classical Chinese ethnic identity from very early on in Chinese history, and just enduring for some 2,000 years, but it became increasingly complex over the course of those 2,000 years, right, the imperial era, and displayed different emphases in different periods. And I'll try and kind of map that out with diagrams in just a little bit. Now, here's the thing, not everybody in the Chinese empires had a classical Chinese identity. In fact, I would say that, in every period, the majority of, subjects of the Chinese empires actually did not, right? Because the individual's affinity to a classical Chinese identity was actually tied to two things. And I think a mistake that many of my colleagues might make is that they will kind of focus on one of those two things and say, well, yeah, that's the kind of defining factor in classical Chinese identity. So if they have that, then that's ethnic, or if they don't have that, then it's not ethnic. But anyway, the first kind of element here is an identification with ancestral roots, which could be real or could be invented in this kind of original Sinitic core region, the central lands. I'll show you a map on the next slide that kind of like gives you a sense of what I'm talking about here. The central lands, right? In Chinese, Zhongguo, which is actually kind of still the name of China today, right? And the second element is identification of a Confucian concept of civilization that is defined by a few things: a mythic narrative of ancient cultural heroes and sage kings, certain ritual and ethical norms found in the classics, which usually in my sources are referred to by this phrase: ritual propriety and moral duty, liyi, and a perception of the ethnic groups, right, which are often called zhong or lei, right, types or kinds in my kind of classical Chinese sources, right, a perception of them as morally deficient barbarians who lacked these norms, right? So my take on this is that strong identification with both elements was typically and increasingly found in the classically educated literati elite over the course of Imperial Chinese history, right? Whereas Han identity was typically held by or kind of imposed from above on non-elite populations, right? The literati elite did not typically kind of like thinking of itself as Han, right? It was much more predisposed to think of itself as Hua or Xia, right? These kind of classical Chinese markers or terms of identity that were found in the Confucian classics, unlike Han. So here's a diagram, right? The map is coming next, right? Here's a diagram of kind of like what the classical Chinese ethnic identity sort of looks like, right? You have the Chinese inhabiting the central lands, right? Here, and you have the barbarians on every side, right? And there are different names for different kinds of barbarians, right? Depending on which side of the central lands they're on, right? But they can all collectively also be called, right, the Yi of the four quarters, right? Or the Yi Di, right? Di being the term used for the kind of northern barbarians, and Yi the term being used for the eastern barbarians. So this is a kind of like a literary figure of speech called synecdoche. This idea, this practice of using one part of the whole to represent the whole, right? So Yi is one of these types of barbarians, but when they say the four Yi or the Yi of the four quarters, you're talking about all of them, right? Just like Yi Di are just two of the types, but when you say Yi Di, it's understood to include all of these barbarians beyond the central lands. So where are the central lands, right? So in the time that Confucius lived and wrote, it was kind of like a space roughly within the dotted circle here. And in the Han period, it was kind of like this. So it expanded a little bit to the east and to the west, right? And in the Song Dynasty, which was kind of 1,000 years later, right, it pretty much is still the same size. So, the central lands is this, very enduring concept that's sort of enshrined in the Confucian classics that, marks the original Sinitic core of civilization, right? And as the Chinese empire expands and contracts, really its size and shape remains quite constant. But there is also this tendency among the Chinese empires to refer to the entire empire also kind of synecdoche way, right, as the central lands, right? Even though the original central lands right, is really this size and shape. Okay, so recently it has been suggested by one of my colleagues that for Confucianism, whether a group of peoples are civilized or not is not predetermined, unlike the Western view on geography, right? It is based on human agency. So in other words, any group of people can become civilized, right? There's no kind of predetermined center of civilization, right? Now, my take on that is that some Confucian thinkers in pre-imperial times, maybe including Confucius himself, although it's really hard to kind of say based on just what survives of what he's supposed to have said, right? May have espoused such universalistic ideas of civilization and morality, but they were effectively negated by the kind of civilization state discourse in the imperial era, the early imperial era, right? Because imperial elites with a strong classical Chinese identity kind of tended to favor this relatively stable, ritualized, symbolic hierarchy in foreign relations, which often is called the tributary or tribute system, with a single dynastic civilization state ruling over the central lands at the apex of that hierarchy, right? The so-called Cinecentric world order. Now, this idea of a sort of stable symbolic hierarchy served in part to dampen the kind of expansionist ambitions that Imperial Universalism would otherwise encourage. So when emperors were interested in expanding the empire beyond what the imperial elites or the literati, right, as we often call them, right, considered to be sustainable, they would use this idea of a stable kind of Cinecentric world order and a tributary order to say that expansion is not necessary. And in fact, that it actually goes against heaven's will, because heaven actually set these boundaries between Chinese and barbarians that are not meant to be breached from either side. Right? Whether barbarians invading the central lands or the central lands expanding beyond into the lands of the barbarians. So imperial Chinese elites were prone to essentializing ethnic differences for rhetorical or polemical ends when justifying the Cinecentric world order and interpreting the proper boundaries of the civilization state, right? Is it here or is it there? Is it this desert or this mountain range, or is it some other place, right? But these interpretations often, I will say, conflated ethnic, cultural, and geopolitical boundaries in a manner that was quite contrary to reality, right? In other words, the Chinese empires were often, or actually I would say always, much more ethnically, culturally diverse than the civilization state discourse was willing to acknowledge, right? It would tend to speak of the frontiers or boundaries of the empire as basically the borders between civilization and barbarism, or between the Chinese and the others, the barbarians. But in fact, there were always ethnic groups within the frontiers of this, imperial state that the Chinese would also consider to be, different from themselves. Now, here's an interesting thing, right? Which leads me to argue that race, as understood by the CRT kind of scholars as a kind of state enforced and institutionalized kind of ethnic hierarchy or ethnic inequality, did not typically exist in Chinese ruled imperial states, right? They typically did not institutionalize ethnic hierarchies legally. If you look at the legal codes of the Chinese ruled empires, whether it's the Han or the Tang or the Ming, there's very little ethnic distinction, right, let alone discrimination within these legal codes, right? All subjects of the emperor, right, basically everyone who pays taxes to the emperor, rather than tribute, as the barbarians are supposed to do, right? Everyone who pays taxes is treated kind of pretty much on the same level, except that they are, of course, distinguished based on other categories: status groups, family structures, and gender, right? So how you're treated under the law actually does not have much to do with your ethnicity at all, right? Instead, it has to do with what status group you belong to, right? Are you a peasant? Do you come from a family of officials? Are you a merchant? Are you a slave? Things like that, right? And then family structures, what place you are in your family, right? And against whom did you commit a crime? If it's against a member of your family, right? Is it your senior or your junior, right? Are you the husband? Are you the wife? Are you the concubine or the wife? Things like that, right? And then gender, of course, is also part of that. So here's another of my positions, right? There's a key concept behind these essentialized interpretations of ethnic difference in Imperial China, and ethnic hierarchy, this idea of qi, right? The Chinese believed that qi basically was what everything in the cosmos was made out of. But it, basically qi comes in different purities or different balances, and there's different there's yin and yang, right? Two poles of qi, and there are different balances of yin and yang, different kind of quantities of yin and yang in everything that exists. And so qi cosmology could be used to explain all kinds of human diversity, right? And it was. So discourses of qi determinism or qi alterity, right? Qi difference were originally employed primarily for this kind of anti-expansionist civilization state rhetoric. The idea is that we should not go and conquer these barbarians because their qi makes them so inferior that even if we try to civilize them, they would not be able to become civilized, right? They're just too different in their qi, too inferior in their qi to be worth it. But these discourses also came to be used over time to rationalize ethnocentric beliefs in innate Chinese superiority, right? And to rationalize them as consistent with the more universalistic or moralistic aspects of Neo-Confucian thought, right? Which is in Chinese often called Daoxue. So some of you may be familiar with Neo-Confucianism. I'm not going to have time to really sort of explain what that is, unfortunately. But you can think of this actually kind of comparatively with Christian humanism. That Christianity has actually very strong humanistic and universalistic aspects, but in early modern and modern Europe, and also in America, for that matter, the kind of universalistic and humanistic elements of Christianity were often sort of like accompanied by Western theories of polygenism and scientific racism for the purpose of justifying racial discrimination and racial inequality, right? Polygenism being this idea that God didn't make just one human race; He actually made a few races, some of which were superior and some of which were inferior. So here are just two examples. I'm not sure if I'm going to have time to kind of really go into them. Right here, this is one single Neo-Confucian philosopher from the 12th century, pretty well-known one, Shao-yun, right? Who, in two different contexts, kind of said two very different things about human difference and qi. Right? Here he says the central lands are superior and the barbarians are inferior because the central lands have received balanced qi from heaven and earth. So that's where ritual propriety and moral duty are found. That's where civilization is found. Right? So Confucius was not a bigot for no good reason. That he was not discriminating against the barbarians just because he was Chinese. It's because the qi basically kind of just makes it that way, right? And then here, on the other hand, in the second quote, right, he basically says human beings are all without exception made of the same qi, right? Why should there be any idea of them and us, right? Space and time, basically the universe have not set barriers between human beings, and human beings themselves have set barriers between themselves. We originally were all one family when the world first came to be. So this very universalistic idea of humanity, right? It's really hard to kind of like square that with this other way of talking about qi and human difference. But basically, the same Neo-Confucian philosopher was capable of expressing them both, and he wasn't the only one, right? I found numerous other Chinese Confucian philosophers or Neo-Confucian philosophers who have sort of contradicted themselves in this way because it kind of depends on the context in which they're speaking, right? Are they trying to justify the Cinecentric world order, or are they trying to kind of convince their audience that moral improvement or moral perfection are attainable by all human beings? So it kind of depends on what point they're trying to make. So here's my point 6 is actually divided into a few different subpoints, right? So 6b is that there's another, commonly used kind of pseudo-classical essentializing trope from one of the Confucian classics that was used, especially in the Ming period, right, to justify kind of distrust towards inner Asian immigrant groups, especially the Mongols in the Ming period, right? So this is what I call the Xin alterity discourse, Xin being the Chinese concept of the heart, but also the mind, right? So basically kind of like the seat of both the human reasoning, especially moral reasoning, and also the emotions. So the quote is, they are not our kin and kind, they're not our zule, so their hearts and minds must differ from ours, right? This is originally not really about ethnic difference, but it kind of like got reinterpreted that way in order to justify, right? Arguments that because they're not the same ethnic group as us, we can never trust them to kind of act in our interest rather than theirs. Here's another kind of thing that I find interesting, right? Which is that if you look carefully, yes, these Qi alterity and Xin alterity ways of talking about human difference did exist and kept recurring in different periods, and they have sometimes be called kind of racist or racialist. This kind of essentializing idea of either human inferiority or the idea that human ethnic difference basically kind of predetermines the morality or the kind of trustworthiness of a person, right? But they tended not to have a practical effect on the management of ethnic diversity within Chinese ruled empires, right? So if you sort of like look at what was actually done on the level of policy, right? Forced ethnic assimilation, either via resettlement or through intermarriage, was sometimes proposed or attempted as a solution to managing immigrant populations, like Mongols, for example, but it was not consistently state policy, right? And neither was segregation along ethnic lines or expulsion of ethnic others from the empire, right? There was almost never a concerted policy, even though some proposals of that kind were sometimes made. They were never really sort of adopted by the empires and put into practice, right? So the most common stance actually adopted by the imperial state was one of gradual integration via, what I call, benign neglect, which I know it might be a kind of weighted term because it has a history in this country as well in terms of racial relations. But the idea is that if we leave non-Chinese, barbarian immigrant groups alone, they will gradually, of their own accord, sort of integrate and acculturate and assimilate into the Chinese population, simply because there's just so many more of us than them, right? So individual officials on the frontier might adopt more activist civilizing projects focused on educating and acculturating native kind of barbarian elites on the frontier. But state policy kind of tended to be just let things be, and over time it was all going to work out because they will sort of become more like us. Now, point 7 is that Chinese supremacism developed out of the civilization state discourse and became a distinct ideology in the Southern Song and Ming periods of Chinese history, right? With strong links to Neoconfucian thought. The central premise of Chinese supremacism is that any situational barbarian rule over the civilization state of the central lands is politically illegitimate and a morally unacceptable inversion of proper human hierarchies. Although there are exceptions very rarely made by Chinese supremacist thinkers for highly Sinicized barbarian rulers who adopted so much in the way of Chinese moral norms, ritual propriety, moral duty, and so on, right? And promoted Confucianism to such a degree that basically you can make an exception and say, well, they were Sinicized enough that they weren't really barbarians anymore. And this is this exceptional sort of like acceptance of Sinicized barbarian rulers is often, I think, overstated as kind of evidence that the Chinese were very culturalistic and not ethnocentric, not racist. The fact is that it very rarely happens, although it can, right? Point 8, Chinese supremacism, I believe is sufficiently distinctive as an ideology for characterizing as either nationalistic or racist to be misleading. And here I part company with some of my colleagues in the field. For example, I've named 2 here, one of whom was actually my teacher at UC Berkeley. So, I respect his work a lot, but on this point, I actually kind of have a different opinion. And so these 2 colleagues read certain forms of Song Dynasty, Song period civilization state discourse in Chinese supremacism as evidence for a decisive shift from Imperial Universalism to proto-nationalism or national consciousness. I kind of would prefer to not call it nationalism or racism because it tends to muddy the waters. And I find Chinese supremacism to be, kind of distinct because it is applied not to ruling, subject populations, but really a kind of a way of thinking about foreign relations and about political legitimacy and the world order as a whole. So in other words, it's not Chinese supremacism was not used as a justification for segregating or discriminating between ethnic populations within the empire. So I've got all these diagrams, and I doubt I'm going to have time to really go into them. And I have some quotes here also that maybe we could look into if there's time during the Q&A. But I'm going to have to go to points 9 and 10 and kind of wrap it up there because I think my time is running out. So point 9 is that the situation actually is kind of different under what I call conquest. Well, not just me, but a lot of my colleagues have called them conquest dynasties, right? Including Professor Burge, I think, including the Mongol Yuan Empire and the Manchu Qing Empire, right? Under conquest dynasties, inner Asian empires based in the conquest and rule of the Sinitic core region from outside, from inner Asia, right? Institutionalized internal ethnic hierarchies actually did exist, right? But for the purpose of countering Chinese social, cultural, and demographic dominance. In other words, Chinese elite culture and the Chinese population, which is so dominant within that space, the Sinitic core region, that these inner Asian empires that conquered it and tried to rule it had to actually institutionalize ethnic hierarchies internally and actually discriminate between ethnic groups for the purpose of preserving the identity and solidarity of the conquering ethnic group, the Mongols, the Manchus, for example, right? So in other words, ethnic supremacy or ethnic discrimination or inequality, right, which could be understood as race in CRT terms, actually was a feature of internal governance in such empires, conquest dynasty empires, unlike in Chinese ruled empires, right? That's not to say the Chinese ruled empires were not supremacist, but not in this way, right? And as I said, this is due to the more precarious ethnic minority status of their ruling elites, right? Now, the funny thing is that this kind of internal ethnic hierarchy in conquest dynasties was not justified using supremacist rhetoric. There was no attempt at saying, well, the Mongols are superior to the Han Chinese, or the Manchus are superior to Han Chinese because they got better qi, or they're morally superior, or their culture is better, and therefore they deserve to rule over the Chinese. Instead, conquest dynasties tended to try and mitigate ethnic tensions and delegitimize Chinese supremacism among their population, especially among the literati elite, who had this classical Chinese identity, by actually espousing an ideology of Confucian Universalism, which I actually argue really only tends to exist in these conquest dynasty situations. When Chinese actually are ruling over the empire, they tend not to actually go as far as Confucian Universalism, because that would sort of like defeat the idea of the Cinecentric world order and Chinese supremacism. So Confucian Universalism really is a thing under conquest dynasties because it serves their purposes, right? To kind of like delegitimize this kind of supremacist thinking. So in this kind of universalism, a ruler's legitimacy was not determined by Han ethnic origin, right? And in fact, these conquest dynasties tend to emphasize this Han identity over classical Chinese identity because it basically is much more neutral in connotation than the classical Chinese identity, right? Classical Chinese identity carries the very strong implication that anyone who's not classically Chinese is, by definition, barbarian and inferior and uncivilized, right? So it's not determined by Han ethnic origin, but by moral authority, or, it's sometimes translated as virtue, and by adherence to ritual propriety and moral duty. So anybody, whether it's Manchu or Han or Mongol, can rule over the civilization state, right? Because anyone can become Confucian with the right amount of effort. So these conquest dynasties also sought to de-ethnicize the central lands, these concepts or these identities of central lands and Hua, right? So basically kind of just separate them from this idea of ethnic identity, right? To be Hua is not to be ethnically Chinese. It just means to be a civilized resident of the civilization state and the Sinitic core, right? The same thing is the central lands is not just the classically Chinese people, right? Anybody who moves in the central lands and basically becomes civilized in the central lands or becomes Confucian in the central lands, basically belongs to the central lands, right? But they also, at the same time, as it says here, balance this kind of conservative, Cinecentric civilization state discourse that was at the heart of the tribute-based world order, which they were never entirely comfortable with, although they would use it and appropriate it for their purposes, right? With more expansive ideas of Imperial Universalism, this idea that the emperor has a mandate to rule over everybody everywhere, right? And it, ethnicity really has nothing to do with it. So these empires were often ethnically discriminatory in policy, but highly universalistic in rhetoric. To some degree, like what CRT scholars say is the case for the United States, right? That the universal, American rhetoric is very universalistic in nature, right? Like, that the American dream, basically anybody can aspire to that. It's open to everyone, right? Everyone has an equal chance, it's a level playing field. But that there is actually this reality of systemic racism, institutionalized, inequality or inequity or disadvantages, right? That actually make that kind of, equality not really realizable in fact, right? So here's a diagram that, I might be able to show you later, but I'm going to have to sort of like wrap up here by showing you a quote from a book whose cover I showed you earlier in the talk, right? Mark Elliott's The Manchu Way, right? So Mark Elliott basically says here, that there is this rhetoric of equality, of Manchu Han equality in the Manchu Qing empire, but the reality is one of Manchu supremacy, right? Manchus lived in separate ghettos. They enjoyed a special relationship with the emperor. So, being in a ghetto in this case is not a disadvantage. It's not about being marginalized. It actually is about, a certain kind of form of privilege. They were significantly privileged over Han in terms of entry and promotion into officialdom. They systematically received all manner of financial and material bonuses and enjoyed special legal preferences over the Han, even though they were, a very small minority compared to the Han population, which the Han population by the 18th century, by the end of the 18th century, was about 400 million, right? And the Manchus were, a small fraction of that. So there was a tension, as Mark Elliott says, between the two fundamental truths of the Qing political world, right? Namely that bannermen, especially Manchus, they're also Mongol and Han bannermen. That's not something that I'm going to have time to talk about right now, but I'll be happy to say more about that. Enjoyed a certain superiority over Han Chinese, right? But one also had to play along with this, the official denial of this superiority, at least most of the time, in the name of Manchu Han unity. Right. So when I say that, when I say that the answer to the question of was there racism, was there racial inequality, racial discrimination in Imperial China, kind of depends on our definition of race. It kind of like ties in with this here. If CRT defines race as institutionalized ethnic inequalities and hierarchies, right, and the supremacy of one group over the other. Right. We can see that actually in the Manchu Qing dynasty, and I would say also the Mongol Yuan and maybe a number of other Conquest Dynasty situations that I haven't mentioned here. But they actually, did not exist in Chinese-ruled empires. Right. That being said, Chinese-ruled empires, in certain periods, especially, had a pretty supremacist understanding of, what the world should look like. Right. It should be a Chinese-dominated world, a Cinecentric world, one in which the barbarians were in a subordinate and inferior position. So, Chinese supremacism does exist, but it's not the same thing as race, as CRT would understand it. And I'm going to end the talk here. Thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to your questions. And, maybe I might be able to show you some things that I skipped over, but, thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Yang. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. Very, very interesting. I am quite interested in some of the ones you skipped over, particularly about the Yuan dynasty. And maybe I just would start off asking, in the Yuan dynasty, they're quite open about separating out Mongols, Inter-Asians in various ways. I mean, in fact, what happens though, it moves around and the legal privileges change around, but they're always there. So it seems to me in CRT in the United States, the universalist equality discourse is out there, and then the legal, white supremacist structures are hidden. They're not openly declared. I mean, the Mongols are quite forthcoming that this is how it should be, and
right.
Kublai says, "Look, we're going to have Darugachi has to be a Mongol, and they'll have a Chinese. He assigns certain ideas of
it's only much more transparent and codified in the law, and not insidious or invisible, right? Although in the U.S. there was a period when these things, when these kind of forms of discrimination and segregation were in the law, right? They're not anymore. But CRT basically makes the case that even though they're not in the law anymore, they still basically are embedded in institutions and systems and structures that haven't changed enough.
And they are in some laws, of course. They are in some laws, and they're totally embedded in structure. So it just seems a little bit different. And also, I think, I'm not aware of so much discourse in the Mongol period, the Yuan, about this unity of all peoples. What they seems to me instead, they argue, as you discuss, a universalist empire group, that they have legitimacy to rule over lots of different ethnic groups, which the Qing also did. I think Crossley's work shows that you sort of establish different constituencies, and then you apply certain methods of legitimacy over them. Yeah,
and they would use Confucian methods. They would use kind of Tibetan Buddhist methods, right? Yeah, so they could basically use everything that they could put in their toolkit, right? And the Mongols did a bit of that as well, although I think they were kind of less. They kind of leaned less into the Confucian aspect of that than the Manchus did. Although I might be wrong.
I disagree with that, actually. I mean, they were aware. Well, perhaps Kublai in particular, his advisors certainly.
Right. Oh yeah. I mean, like Xu Heng definitely kind of like made a lot of that, right? In my source book, for example, I have this quote by Xu Heng that says, the very name Yuan, right, the very name of the dynasty basically shows that basically it transcends all these differences between human beings, right? It's like there is no us or them. There is no ethnic difference. Yuan conveys this concept that basically everybody belongs.
Yeah, I guess I would emphasize that everybody belongs, not that there's no ethnic difference. In other words, we control everyone because we are legitimate to all different people.
Right.
But certainly the Kublai and others did many things to appeal to Chinese Confucians, and lots of rituals and programs that they put forward, even architecture and building the city based on classical models, et cetera. They're promoting, of course, Daoshui and the Neo-Confucianism, and eventually restarting the exam system, a whole range of
which actually kind of satisfied a large number of Neo-Confucian literati in the Yuan period, right? Which is why some historians have made a lot of the kind of like Chinese supremacist rhetoric put out by Ming Taizu during the rebellion against the Yuan, right? But there's a really good young scholar in China. I'm blanking out his name, unfortunately, but I cite him in my book, who basically made a good case that the reason why the anti-Yuan rebels had to really play up this idea of barbarian inferiority and Chinese supremacism was because otherwise they stood no chance of overcoming the Neo-Confucian ethic of loyalty to the ruling dynasty, right, regardless of ethnicity. And even then, it didn't really succeed, right? If you look in the Yuan Shi, in the biographies of loyalist martyrs, they're Chinese, Mongols, Muslims, like different people in there whose lives basically ended at their own hands because they would not submit to Ming rule. They basically believed that Neo-Confucian loyalty dictated that who cares if it's Mongol or Chinese, whether the emperor is Mongol or Chinese. I serve one dynasty only, and I die with it.
I agree with that. In other words, the Neo-Confucian Universalism legitimized the Yuan. They had to go against that somehow, and then this ethnic othering was a way to do that. And there are many ways that was carried out in the Yuan-Ming transition.
So some of the most strident kind of Chinese supremacist or kind of anti-Mongol rhetoric coming out of the Ming really kind of comes from that quandary, where they have to make a strong case that the Yuan was not a legitimate dynasty, right, and that the Mongols that are still out there on the steppe and making problems for the Ming, right, because the Ming is not able to assert supremacy over them, right, that they have no claim to the mandate, even though they still call themselves the Yuan out there, right?
Exactly.
So I mean, if you understand that context, then the Ming is it's not just simply sort of like a xenophobic regime, right? They actually have an agenda. The Chinese supremacism is their way of asserting that they have the legitimate right to rule over the Chinese and the Mongols both.
Exactly, and to overthrow the Mongols, yes.
Right.
So we have some very good questions coming from the audience. So let me start through those, okay? We'll start with a question from Alex Kyriakakis. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. And they say, what would you say the relationship between epidermal racism and visual representations is? Do visual representations perpetuate this ideology, or are they the cause behind it?
Does he mean in the Chinese context? I'm assuming that he means in Imperial China.
I think, yeah, well, I guess it's a very general question. I think that came up when we were discussing the idea of epidural racism.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, discrimination based on skin color, it's not completely absent or non-existent in Imperial China, but it's just very rare because most of the peoples that the Chinese interacted with and had conflicts with tended to look very, very similar to them, right? The Mongols, for example. So they would emphasize other things that were not, physical or biological in nature, but were really more about how you did your hair, right? What you ate, right? So those mutton eating, fur wearing, felt wearing, pigtailed barbarians, right? Like they smell of mutton, they stink of mutton. They would find other ways of kind of like differentiating themselves from the nomads. But the Chinese did encounter, right, black peoples that we might call black in certain periods of the history. Some of these were from Southeast Asia and were darker skinned. And by the late Ming, we do know that the Portuguese were bringing African slaves into Macau. And so they did have, they did have a sense of curiosity, but also, kind of, unfortunately, you often see also a sense of sort of revulsion towards these peoples. A kind of like often a description of them as, barely human. And I think part of that was informed by, basically the fact that they showed up as slaves, right? Whether the Southeast Asian darker peoples or the African peoples who were brought in by the Portuguese, they showed up as slaves, and the Chinese kind of tended to sort of respond to them, react to them as kind of degraded or debased kind of specimens of humanity, right? But then they had all these myths, and in the source book, I have a section in one chapter about black peoples and what the Chinese thought about them. But this association with black peoples with slavery actually kind of goes back really far into Chinese history. Actually, our colleague Don Wyatt, who teaches at Middlebury College, is giving a talk at Chicago sometime next month about this idea of how the idea of blackness actually can be traced back much further in Chinese history than we think. This idea of black peoples. He's written a whole book about this, of course, right? The blacks of premodern China. But just to give one example, right? In the late Ming, there was this official who went to Macau and encountered African slaves that the Portuguese had brought in, and he basically heard stories that if they switched from eating raw food to cooked food, then their skin would get lighter, right? And he also heard stories that their bones too were black, right? So there's all kinds of misinformed and ignorant thinking about African peoples that the whole situation is not helped by the fact that the Chinese, until quite late in their history, almost only ever encountered dark peoples or darker peoples in a state of kind of human bondage, which kind of like makes them tend to lack empathy or respect for these peoples, unfortunately.
Very interesting. Yeah. We have a good number of questions left, so let's move along.
Okay.
So the next one is from Christina Nguyen, and she writes, aside from political motives, were there other significant motives for policies that set the Chinese as supreme over other ethnic groups?
Were
there other motives besides these?
Besides political motives?
Political motive, right.
Right.
Groups.
Yeah. It was, predominantly, I would say, political. But then, when the Neo-Confucians kind of got into supremacist discourse, they tended to kind of make this political hierarchy or political inequality between Chinese and barbarians on the kind of world order scale, kind of like consonant with other hierarchies that they believe are normative in human society, basically male over female, right? Or ruler over minister, or ruler over subject. I would have showed you a quote if I had time, right, from this Ming Neo-Confucian philosopher called Shao-yun, right, who basically kind of writes, the Chinese should rule the barbarians, and barbarians should not rule the Chinese, right? That's just, the way that the world is supposed to be. And by the same token, rulers rule over subjects, and subjects do not rule over rulers. And men have power over women, and women do not have power over men. So basically, male supremacism and Chinese supremacism, right, often go hand in hand in the thinking of these people. They basically think of the ideal world as one in which these hierarchies are respected and are not violated. Right. So, politics is part of it, but they also, Confucianism also, especially Neo-Confucianism, also kind of subscribes to this idea that, certain inequalities and hierarchies in the human condition are actually good for social order, right? Very different from the liberal understanding, right, in which, human equality actually equals to human flourishing. Much of Confucian thought actually does not subscribe to that, right? It believes that certain hierarchies and inequalities, as long as they're harmonious and morally kind of normative in nature, actually make society better.
Okay, our next question comes from one of our advanced graduate students, Nina Nie, and she asks, "Dear Professor Yang, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. If possible, I wish to ask 2 brief questions and look forward to hearing your opinions. It is mainly regarding the applicability of concepts of racism and nationalism. 1, if we add critical race theory to racism, concepts of racism, and accept that race is largely a social construct and thus flexible and transformable, will that change or revise the argument in your book that ethnicized orthodoxy and ethnocentric moralism work better than racism?" Yeah, just a minute.
Oh, wow, she's read my book.
Wait, I'm sorry. The question just disappeared strangely. Uh-oh. Oh, no.
Did you maybe click, go to answered? We're hearing from,
okay, thank you.
from one of our colleagues. That go to answer, we can see it there.
Yeah, these are actually, a number of students read your book in my class. Which, thank
you very much for reading.
Yeah, you have these 2 ideas of ethnicized orthodoxy and ethnocentric moralism, very important in your book. That you argue work better than racism, which you said conventional racism did not emphasize enough on one's moral, which did not place enough emphasis on one's moral and cultural transformation, page 19. And then 2, if we agree with Professor Dewara's argument that nationalism is blended with Imperial Universalism, exploitation, and hierarchy arrangements in his Manchu book, can we still agree that Professor Tackett's argument that the Song marked a proto-nationalism still works? Thank you very much. So
well, these are really good and deep questions, and I doubt that most of the audience has read my book, so it's like I'm not going to be able to sort of really use those concepts in a way that's coherent to a lot of you. But when I wrote my book, I had not really sort of like started thinking seriously about CRT yet, right? It was really last year when Geraldine Heng, who wrote the book, The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages, right? When she reached out to me, that and of course, like Rebecca Kennedy, my colleague at Denison, also, had some influence on me in that regard, right? That I began to think, so I've been kind of using the concept of race and racism in the classical 19th century European scientific racism mode, right? And I've assumed that basically that's all that racism can mean, right? Or race can mean. So when in my book, I said that, this idea of barbarization kind of makes the idea of separate Chinese and barbarian races not really tenable, right? This idea that ethnocentric moralism basically argues that Chinese people can turn into barbarians, and then from barbarians turn into animals, right? Simply by behaving immorally, right? And so I basically said that this kind of like makes problematic this idea that the Chinese thought of the barbarians as a separate race from themselves, right? Either because of Qi difference or something else. But yeah, I mean, it's like what I'm doing in this talk is trying to apply or think about, whether a different understanding of race could be applied to thinking about Imperial Chinese history. And if we did do that, right, what we would come up with, right? And then the second question was about nationalism, right? And I'm not sure I have time to really kind of go into this because it's a really, really complex thing. Maybe in the discussion after the talk, right? If your student will stay, right, we could talk about this more. But the reason why I kind of really don't buy the Song proto-nationalism theory is that I don't think there's strong evidence that the Song ever stopped thinking of itself in Imperial Universalist terms, right? So even if some of their rhetoric sometimes kind of seem to be drawing a very kind of clear boundary between themselves and the barbarians outside, right? The central lands and the barbarians outside, that's not necessarily all that new. Civilization state discourse does that all the time. And the Song basically still considered itself to be a multi-ethnic empire, not a Han sort of nation state, and spoke accordingly in many contexts, right? So yeah, I just don't think that kind of drawing a clear sort of kind of demarcation between Imperial Universalism in the Tang and before, right, and sort of national consciousness or nation state identity in the Song really kind of works. But yeah, I'll be happy to talk about that more later, right? It's like I have a lot of thoughts about this that I don't think we have time to really go through here. I think we're going to have time for one more question.
Yeah,
I heard from our host.
Thank you, Lena, for that excellent question and very stimulating indeed. And indeed, it deserves much more discussion. We have one more question from Professor Jason Webb, my colleague here at USC, and he says, thanks very much for a stimulating talk. I wanted to ask to speak in a little more detail about distinctively pre-modern Chinese definitions of barbarity. One that came to mind while listening to your remarks appears in the preface to the Winshuan Poetic Anthology, and he then types it out here. I guess if I put answer live, it'll come up. Let's see if I...
okay, I can see it now, yes.
Okay, you see it now? Okay, go. It has always been striking to me that here we have a bundle of barbaric characteristics that combine animalism as well as the absence of literacy. At the same time, in a macro-historical perspective, it seems to suggest that we evolved from this primal state. My point is that at least here, it is not a question of a hierarchy of people, but that rather that at some point in time, people were the same as animals. Is such discourse restricted to ruminations on the primal period, or do you see similar characterizations of human difference or specifically illiteracy?
So, right, this is a great question, a great example. Yes, this idea that the Chinese too evolved from a kind of primeval animal-like state into a civilized state with the help of these sage kings, right? These civilizing cultural heroes who taught them how to cook their food, build houses, wear clothes, stuff like that. Yeah, I mean that's it's kind of standard in the Confucian narrative of civilization, right? But in the imperial period, there's a good number of thinkers who said, well, yeah, the barbarians are still in the state that we were back then, right? But they can't advance out of that state, unlike us. Not just because they don't have sages living among them, right? And not just because we aren't ruling over them and therefore haven't been able to civilize them, but because their qi kind of makes them incapable of learning what we learned from the sages, right? So qi determinism in this case is kind of used often as a way of justifying, not expanding the empire because, it's not worth it. They're not going to ever become like us, even if we ruled over them, right? But also is used in other contexts as a way of explaining why barbarian inferiority is a sort of like a permanent state, right? They will never be equal to us because their qi makes them more like animals than human beings. And there's a wide range of people who subscribe to that or express that idea. Zhu Xi, like the famous Neoconfucian, is one of them. But in the late Ming, I found this interesting example of someone who kind of like goes against that trend and argues that actually the movement of Qi means that barbarians will eventually become civilized because Qi is actually circling around the world. It started in the northwest, and then it went to the north, and then it went to the east, and then it went to the southeast, right? So he's basically tracing the spread of civilization across the what he believes is the known world, right? So basically, the North China became civilized first, and then finally you got to like Fujian and Guangdong and Guangxi, right? And he's official writing in Guangxi about the barbarians in those parts. And he's saying, see, they're becoming civilized now as well, because the Qi is cycling to where we are now. And they are receiving the Qi that will allow them to be civilized. And who knows, one day, Chinese officials may be governing in Burma as well, because the Qi is really all concentrating here now. So, and he says, yeah, you know, the barbarians are kind of like animalistic now, because you know, they're kind of like what we were before we got the Qi that allowed us to be civilized. But the Qi is moving, it's coming. And that's why Ming rule in Guangxi will not amount to nothing, right? It will eventually lead to the civilizing of this frontier. Yeah. So, you know, it can be kind of framed in different ways, but the more common way of framing it was that, you know, barbarian Qi basically has kind of halted their civilizational advancement at a certain point, and it will not progress further. Whereas, you know, the Chinese living in the center of the world with the best Qi basically have been able to escape that fate. So yeah, that's basically how I would sort of explain the whole issue. Yeah, but it's a great question, and I love that quote that your colleague shared.
Right, and everyone can read it. Well,
yeah, everyone can see it now.
Everyone can see it in the question, so all those, you can take a look, everyone can take a look at that. Well, thank you very much. I think we'll wrap it up here, and I'll turn it over to Professor Lee again. And thank you for a very stimulating talk and for excellent questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions, everybody, and for listening to my talk.
Well, I just like to thank both Professor Bird and Professor Yang for this really thought-provoking talk. And on behalf of the East Asian Studies Center, we thank you for providing us with so much to think about. And that final note about the Qi movement is actually quite really thought-provoking. And I've also been thinking a lot about that in terms of the Buddhist dimension, but we can talk about it at another time. So thank you to the audience for sticking with us for almost 90 minutes on a Friday evening. And so I hope that you'll come join us for other events by the East Asian Studies Centers. Until then, good evening. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all.
Thank you.